So, welcome to Holland tonight and the Maritime Panel of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. This is the Transportation Finance Seminar. My name is Jovi Tenev. I'm a partner in the Restructuring Finance Group of Holland tonight, and I'm the moderator of the panel. So, I'm at the end of the table. We're going to discuss trends and developments in Brazil, and trying to focus a little bit on shipping, offshore, and vessel finance. We're going to have a moderated discussion, and we encourage questions from the audience during our discussion. At the conclusion here, you're all invited for some refreshments out by the reception area where you came in, near the elevators. So we're all but standing between you and cocktails, so we will be brief and to the point. Our speakers today are Marcela Nagib, Vice President of Nomura, Megan O'Connor, Director at Citigroup, Nick Leone, partner at PJT Partners, formerly Blackstone Restructuring, and Pedro Jardim, partner at Machado, Meyer. So looking at where we are, it's always a good thing to do to take stock of where you are and to look back a little bit about see where you've been and then to imagine where you're going forward. Today, 30 years ago today, on October the 19th, 1987, was Black Monday. The U.S. stock market collapsed. The Dow plunged some 22.6%, the biggest one-day percentage loss in history, bigger than the 1929 stock market crash just before the Great Depression. Nothing since Black Monday has even come close, not the sell-off after September 11 or the 2008 financial crisis. 30 years ago today, prices tumbled, panic spread, and the crash worsened. By the close of trading, the Dow stood at 1,738 points. It was down 508 points, the equivalent of about 5,000 points on the Dow today. So that's looking back. So now let's imagine going forward and where we are going. I'm going to ask Marcela first to just give us a little bit of an overview on investors' perceptions on Brazil, and maybe in general, and then talk a little bit about offshore investment.
My name is Marcela. I'm a credit analyst at Nomura, covering corporates in Latin America. And I focus, one of the sectors that I cover is the oil and gas space. So I covered a lot of the drilling bonds that have been issued over the last few years and that have restructured over the last year and a half. So in terms of the Brazilian economy, I do believe investors have been turning a lot more positive on the economy over the last several months. I think especially since the impeachment last year, several reforms have been implemented. There is expectation of 2 to 3% growth for next year. Inflation is under control. FX seems to be under control. And even though there is a lot of uncertainty over the elections next year, it seems like the markets have decided that it's going to be okay and that it's going to be a pragmatic government with orthodox economic policies. At least that's what the market is telling us in terms of where the Brazilian bonds are trading and what has happened with the equity markets in recent months. So I would say that investors have been getting more constructive about Brazil, and companies have regained access to the market. So we have had several new Brazilian companies coming to the market over recent months after a period that the market was effectively shut to Brazilian companies. And today we actually had a Brazilian airline that issued a bond that's 6%. We were talking about that earlier, and it really shows that investors have gotten more positive and are more constructive about the future. However, I do think investors are being selective. I think a lot has happened in Brazil over the last years. We had a lot of restructurings which have resulted from a government that was very, that intervened a lot in the economy. You had a lot of FX volatility, 3 years of negative growth, high inflation, and the biggest corruption scandal in Brazil, which led to the restructuring of a lot of small and medium companies that are all of very large economic groups, which I don't think investors ever thought would have to restructure at some point. So we saw that I think a big example of that is the Odebrecht Group that has been still going through problems within several different companies. So I think investors, the perception has improved, but they're still being selective, and there's still a lot of restructurings that are underway, and a lot of these problems have to be resolved. And I think that the experience that investors have had with Brazilian restructurings haven't been always the best. So we're talking about that, and I think Nick has some.
Yeah, I would say so. Just by introduction, I'm Nick Leone. I'm a partner at PJT Partners, which was introduced as the former restructuring group of Blackstone. I'm not Brazilian. I don't speak Portuguese. I can order coffee in Portuguese, but that's about it. But I have spent a lot of time in Brazil over the last 10 or 15 years doing restructurings. And Marcela commented on a number of reasons why I think a lot of large corporates have gone through restructurings, whether it be political scandals, access to capital, the slowdown in the economy, which are all sort of related. One of the things that she didn't mention, which to the extent you're not that familiar with corporates in Brazil, is there are a lot of very, very large companies in Brazil that I would almost say are bigger than their credit markets. There are a lot of top companies across a lot of different industries, which are really world leaders in their respective industries, and yet the credit markets, the local credit markets, are probably not at that level. And so you have a lot of big Brazilian companies where their revenue is predominantly denominated in a local currency, and a lot of their costs are in dollars. Marcela mentioned an airline, Azul, very successful airline. I represented in an exchange offer another very successful airline called Gol about 1.5 years ago. And if you look at Gol, not to go into too much detail, but it's a local airline. They don't have a lot of international traffic, so literally 100% of their revenue is denominated in local currency, and probably 85% of their costs are denominated in dollars, because their largest costs are fuel, which is priced in dollars, leasing aircraft, which is in dollars, and maintaining aircraft, which are in dollars. Paying for local employees, that's paid in local currency. But again, there's sort of this mismatch, and people say, well, why don't these companies hedge? It just becomes too expensive to hedge. So again, I've done a lot of restructuring. I do restructurings for a living. I've done a lot in Brazil over the last 15 years. And you tend to see these common themes, which is mismatched currency and access to capital. I would say those are the two biggest things.
Megan, what do you see in terms of general capital market sentiment and bank sentiment globally and in the maritime space or in the transportation space? I mentioned this bond, and I think you want to talk about that.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Megan O'Connor. I'm a director at Citi in their corporate and investment bank, and I'm responsible for covering U.S. shipping clients within our maritime space portfolio, as well as aviation and aircraft leasing. And so, I think what would be helpful, my fellow panelists have more expertise in restructuring and more expertise in Brazil specifically, but my team and our firm was privileged to be part of the Azul bonds, which was referenced a couple of times today and actually priced just a couple of minutes ago. And I think what we saw was Azul went out with a $300 million offering, and this is an unsecured airline credit risk. And so what the emerging market investors are really looking at here is comfort and ability to take real Brazilian risk, right? It's a lot less about an airline, and it's a lot more about where the airline is operating. And the book was 10 times oversubscribed. There were 300 accounts that came in for it was 10 times oversubscribed. They ended up upsizing the deal from $300 million to $400 million, and it priced sub 6%. And given just a corporate decision that they wanted the bond to perform well in the secondary market, they took the 6%. So for 7-year unsecured airline money in the Brazilian market. I think what that really shows is the resilience of the capital markets specifically. But I think there has been an increasing divergence between what you're seeing in the airline space and the aircraft leasing space versus what you're seeing in the maritime space. So in the maritime space, given a lack of consolidation, there hasn't been as much ability for those clients to access the capital markets. And so they have tended to rely a lot more heavily on bank finance. And so while that can be a positive during the downturn because you have relationship banks that you can call to assist in an amendment or a restructuring process, it also, it's really reflective of sort of where we are today. So I think given the downturn and a lot of the operating performance of various shipping subsectors, whether that's offshore, dry bulk, or even tankers today, there has been a ton of capital that has really exited the space. And the regulators, shipping sort of a dirty word, especially for American bulge bracket companies and banks to be involved in. So there is a heightened focus from a regulatory perspective on what we are doing as banks and how we are lending to the space. So I think we've seen a lot more discipline from the banks in terms of which clients they're lending to, and sort of the typical flight to quality, and also on what terms they're willing to enter into transactions. So I would say that one major theme that we have seen in our group is really just sort of the difference in where the aviation credits tend to be going versus where the maritime space is today.
So I think we're seeing in generally in developing markets, things have come up this year 30% or so. But then looking back and what are the kind of the lessons that we've seen in Nick mentioned the problems of currency differential, and then in a restructuring context in Brazil, and what are sort of the key differences compared with looking at Brazil, comparing that with the U.S., which the audience might be a little bit more familiar with. Pedro, do you have a?
Hi, I'm Pedro Jardim from the finance department, structural finance department of Machado Meyer law firm, Brazilian law firm based in São Paulo. We were discussing before, one of the things that in Brazil generally is very different from here, restructurings in New York, is the court procedures are considerably slower, and the tools, the involvement of shareholders and even the precedents in Brazil, the way they tend to be sometimes to be more favorable to companies than lenders would expect generally. I think that's something that still leaves the lenders in a not so comfortable position to rely on a court restructuring on a general basis. So what we were discussing for considering the examples that Marcela mentioned, when we talk about credit recovery or restructuring in Brazil, and we have good examples or some examples in the maritime offshore business, the ones that seem to be more successful from a lender's perspective are those which involved less court procedures and more renegotiation outside of the courts. So one thing that just happened today, for example, the Brazilian courts just homologated the extrajudicial recovery plan for Odebrecht Oil and Gas a few hours ago. So it's an example of a negotiation that went well for most of the creditors, and it was a process that involved a large amount of money for Brazilian market standards, and it's something that could be a good precedent for the future. Our law is not that new, but it's not that old. It's from 2005, our bankruptcy and insolvency law, but we still don't have that many precedents and sufficiently to fill in all the gaps on the procedure. So it's difficult from a lawyer to answer all the questions the creditors might have in a procedure like that. And but the perspective seems to be going towards a good direction.
Yeah, I agree with everything that he just said. I would say for people who are fortunate enough to have not gone through a Brazilian restructuring, it is, as he said, the law was sort of put in place around 10 years ago, so it's relatively new, and it was really modeled after Chapter 11, and I think 95% of it is effective and is going to lead to more fluid restructurings going forward. I would say there are a couple challenges to it. There are just a couple key differences between their law and the Chapter 11 law, which, depending what side of the table you sit on, might be good or bad. But as an example, only a company can file a plan. In the U.S., a company can file a plan for a period of time. They're the only ones that can file a plan for a period of time. They have an exclusive period. And then thereafter, other parties can file a plan. That doesn't exist in Brazil. So it really gives the company a fair amount of leverage. And then with respect to how you think about shareholders versus creditors, in the U.S. under Chapter 11, a judge has the ability to just wipe out shareholders if there's not sufficient value. In Brazil, a judge can't do that. And so if you want to transfer value or transfer ownership from a creditor to a shareholder, you have to basically issue a ton of shares, new shares to creditors to dilute down the old shareholders. The problem is, in order to do that, you have to have a shareholder vote. So it kind of gives the company and shareholders a disproportionate amount of leverage in the process that may be not consistent with sort of where value is, but that's the way the process works.
So this,
This raises a couple of real issues, and that is how do you reach some sort of alignment of interest between the creditors and the company if the creditors have no prospect of ever getting rid of the equity holders in the company?
It's difficult. It's one of the big challenges that we've seen in other restructurings. Not even among creditors you can find alignments, considering shareholders in the equation. Sometimes it's very difficult. One thing that in Brazil is still not a reality. I mean, even though we have the sort of incorporation there, the system, the shareholders should. I mean, it's not like a public listed company with pulverized shareholders here and there, but you have a concentrated shareholding, a controlling shareholder with some sort of like a huge family business sometimes, and that's very complicated. And Brazil would now have some very large groups that, as Nick mentioned, sometimes they are larger than the banks can handle. Is a big credit risk. So the creditors end up looking not only to a specific business but to the full group, and how that could impact the credit of that company in the bank as generally speaking for the whole group. So it's very difficult. It's not a. This is one of the biggest challenges nowadays.
So in
In a typical secured structure, you would expect that the creditors would have a pledge of the shares of the company, that they could step in for the company in the event of a default, step in to manage the company and sell it. And is that something that's doable either practically or legally in Brazil? Will the Brazilian court honor those pledges?
We don't have actually a very good precedent. We don't have precedents on stepping happening in Brazil, to be honest. We had a couple of trials, a couple of things that could be considered as partly as a stepping procedure, but not in fact something like you would have in the US or in the UK. But one thing that has been an issue on judicial recoveries in Brazil is that some courts are deciding that assets that are essential for the companies cannot be sold, cannot be foreclosed, because that's essential.
notwithstanding mortgage interest and so on.
Exactly, exactly. So this is something that sometimes, and in even there is a balance on this, what these courts, these judges understand as the spirit of the judicial recovery law in order to preserve the company and try to make the company be alive and back again on their feet. And on the other hand, like, okay, we need to sell some assets because we need to repay the creditors. This balance is not easy to find, and we have precedents that goes one way and precedents that go on the opposite side. So this is a challenge, and this is something that has been giving some uncertainty, and it's a reflex now. There's a lot of lessons being learned, and especially in the last 2 or 3 years. I think that in Brazil, because of our type of system, of civil law system, we don't have that much attention to court precedents, but specifically on judicial recoveries, court precedents are being perhaps very, very important, more than any other area of law.
Marcela,
Looking at it from the investor's viewpoint.
Yes, no, I think definitely, I think the Brazilian bankruptcy law is a concern, I think, for any U.S. investors, and we've had plenty of examples that show that there's a lot of uncertainty, and it usually takes a very long time, and the lack of an alignment of interest, I think, is a huge concern here. As I mentioned, all the drillers basically had to go through some type of restructuring, and what we've seen is that the extrajudicial route has definitely resulted in much better economic recoveries for investors. And we mentioned, Pedro mentioned earlier, the OOG restructuring case, and what was interesting there, it's in a consensual negotiation, in an out-of-court agreement, the collateral of the creditors was respected, the Petrobras maintained the contracts, and the secured lenders were able to maintain, they will benefit from the cash flows of existing contracts, they will benefit from potential upside if the sector recovers, they will maintain the collateral, and I think that was, in my view, one of the most successful restructurings that we've seen in Brazil, and I think this was a case that the structure worked, but I think it is because the company and the creditors were working to reach a mutual agreement. We had another case that was the first restructuring in the sector in Brazil, that was Jardim, and that was a lot more complicated. You had a very aggressive shareholder that suddenly decided to stop, ran into some financial issues, decided to stop all of the rigs, ended up losing all the contracts with Petrobras. Then, after the default happened, it refused to let the lenders take the rigs out of Brazil. It started some blackmailing and threats. So it was a very difficult case, and it shows how, and then you had a lot of concerns around potential tax and labor issues. So I think the Jardim case was a very complicated case, and it really shows how important it is to look at the sponsor of the transaction and the character of the shareholder, and how this is really key for Brazilian restructuring. One positive thing in the Jardim case is that when the structure was finally tested, it worked. Somehow, we were having this discussion earlier, but once the creditors decided to exercise their step-in rights, I think they exercised it in the US, they took control over the company, and then they were able to get the rig out of Brazil. So in that sense, the structure worked, but it took a long time, and there was a lot of destruction of value during the process. So I don't know if you had something to say about Jardim.
No, yes, there was a couple of, one particular thing happened there from a legal perspective. I mean, there was a step-in happening in the BVI company when there was I think was Mizuho leading the lenders. They were trying to enforce a collateral, and then on the very next day the company filed for a judicial recovery in Brazil, and the stay period started. But then when the plan was presented, because the bank were exercising some type of control, because they were able to appoint the directors and of the managers of the company, the courts understood that the bank could not vote. The bank was completed to vote for the approval of the recovery plan presented to the court. And that was something new in Brazil, was a new discussion that, because, as I said, we don't have much step-in going on in Brazil, and actually this one didn't happen in Brazil, was in BVI, but the company was included amongst the companies as part of the judicial recovery, so this discussion was brought to the court for the first time. And that was a precedent that was not very good for the banks, but now it was a lesson learned that there was a tricky detail that is when the bank notified to exercise the step-in, there was already a power of attorney granted to the firm that filed for the judicial recovery procedure in Brazil. So they didn't even actually argue on if the procedure could have started without the consent of the bank as the new controller, let's say, via the step-in procedure, but because there was no discussion at that time, 6 months later when the plan was presented, they couldn't bring that back again. But it's something that now, I mean, this could be something that could be argued if the bank exercises step-in, try to avoid, try to terminate all the power of attorneys granted to anyone. You don't let the company file for Chapter 11, or you try to somehow bring this matter to discussion as soon as possible to avoid this type of situation.
It was mentioned earlier that I guess the importance of maintenance of the contracts that actually provide the cash flow, and how is that perceived as a sort of a risk management matter?
That the visibility of cash flow is becoming increasingly important from a bank's perspective. In the past, we were able to get comfortable lending on spec. So if you had owners that were placing orders for new tonnage that didn't necessarily have employment at that point in time, a lot of banks, including Citi, were taking sort of a loan-to-value approach. But what we've seen, given the distress across various subsectors in the market, is that a lot of times the break-even levels required to essentially service the debt, if you are taking an LTV approach, are not the rates that are being earned today in the market. And so I think visibility of cash flows, particularly in the offshore space, is increasingly important, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to see a bank essentially lend today unless they felt they had cover. And I would also say, as we look across the space, adequacy of liquidity has really become the name of the game for all of our clients in the maritime space. The ones that have been the most successful in terms of restructuring are the ones in which the contracts have remained intact, as mentioned before. But I think we're also seeing companies taking a more proactive approach to liability management earlier in the cycle. So they're not necessarily just coming to the banks and seeking extensions or deferrals of amortization requirements, et cetera. They're actually taking it upon themselves to either defer CapEx or to scrap assets that maybe are non-core to the business. And I think that is helping from a banking perspective, help come to an agreement sort of outside of the court proceedings, come to an agreement sooner. So if you're doing something to shore up liquidity, whether that's deferral of CapEx or selling of assets, then the banks are probably more willing to give you some leniency in terms of the repayment profile. But I would say cash is king in the shipping industry today.
Yeah, I think in this current environment, even determining what LTV looks like is hard, because it's hard to determine what is the V in the equation, especially in offshore. We have questions.
Yeah.
Sir.
Jovi, I'm going to ask a real stupid question here. So, why couldn't you just create a security in terms of if you're the creditor, in which you have like a right or a warrant that is immediately activated on default, which wipes out the current shareholder group, and you drive the bankruptcy?
You'll have.
So the creditor sits there with a right or a warrant. default occurs, boom, it's activated, you just wipe out the rest of the shareholders.
Well, you have some sort of,
Well, you don't have that here, right?
No, I'm talking about that in Brazil.
No, I know that, but you
Given
don't,
the fact that you can't force the shareholders to
Well,
create the bank to get out of that.
yeah. I guess I would say, and I'm not a lawyer, I would say well, I would say that the whole point of a restructuring is not just to transfer ownership, it's to try to help the company fix itself. And so, an immediate trigger of a default to transfer ownership from the creditor, from the shareholders to the creditors is certainly not the point of restructuring law here. So I don't know why.
But if I can't get the bank, or if I can't get the shareholder to ever agree with me as a creditor, why not drive the system by creating a security that automatically forces the?
Well, I would say, again, I'm playing lawyer. I would say that if the credit markets force that, like until the credit markets force that, you're not going to have it, right? As long as international institutions and lenders and credit markets are willing to provide capital to Brazilian companies along the existing lines, then you're never going to get what you're looking for.
yeah, from a technical legal perspective, we do have some in a share pledge or in a share fiduciary assignment or in type of share security over shares in Brazil, you are allowed to have some sort of mechanisms like that. But the thing is that the law, the bankruptcy law, prevails over whatever you write down in an instrument, in a contract. So one of the things that is very important in the Brazilian law in that aspect is that once the company files for a judicial recovery procedure, you have the 6-month stay period, so the creditors cannot enforce their securities. And even after that period, what we have been seeing in certain decisions is that the courts will consider that some assets are essential for the company, and even though you can have securities, you can have agreements, you simply cannot enforce that.
No, this is exactly like a Chapter 11.
And then the automatic stay, it's quite the same thing
But
here.
it's even worse.
Well, the difference, I think the single difference that's quite material is there are two aspects. One is the inability of creditors to promulgate a reorganization plan. And then the second one is, I guess, the requirement, as I understand it, that the existing shareholders maintain some equity interest in the reorganized company.
It is not exactly, I would say a requirement that they maintain, but they cannot be wiped out automatically. It's something that they continue as shareholder. There must be some sort of agreement. Of course, that if agreement is not achieved, the judge has some power to analyze and to discuss and to intervene and to force a plan that the majority of the lenders would agree. But everything is much more difficult without the agreement of the shareholders, and the shareholders not being aligned with the creditors, generally speaking.
So it's a much more collaborative process, or it requires more collaboration on the part of the creditors and the debtor. I'm wondering, is there a possibility, does the process allow the possibility of debtor in possession financing the way that we see here, whereby existing creditors, some of them anyway, can come together and put some more money back into the company? Nick, have you seen anything like that in your travels to Brazil?
Yes. So the answer is it's a lot more complicated, and I think that if the regulators or authorities in Brazil are trying to make some tweaks around the restructuring process, I know trying to fix DIP financing is one of the things they're focused on. And there's sort of a list of where I would say Brazilian, and you can help me here, Pedro, but there's a list of where I would say what we think of as DIP financing doesn't really work that well in Brazil. And one of them is, as you may or may not be familiar, that a company in the U.S. can go in front of a Chapter 11 judge and on day one get interim relief to provide a lender with super priority status to get access on an interim basis for a certain amount of capital to operate the business. In Brazil, the way it works, and again, you can correct me, but in Brazil, the way it works is if as part of a court process you want to grant collateral to a new or existing lender, a judge has to a judge takes 30 days to approve it. So by definition, the company's not going to be able to get access to capital on day one of a filing, because no one's going to advance the money knowing that they're at risk for 30 days to get collateral. So that's one of the challenges that I know they're trying to fix. I know there are a couple other challenges with DIP financing, but that's a big one.
Yeah, that's the procedure. One of the criticisms, Brazilian law was inspired in Chapter 11, but the specific procedure for DIP financing was not provided in our law. Even though now the courts, there is a procedure pacified, everyone agrees that knows which is the procedure. It takes some time, but there's something in Brazil that is different from here in the U.S. is that the companies, the percentage of recovery of companies which file for judicial recovery is very, very, very low. There was a Folha de São Paulo did a study in 2015. They said it was less than 1% of the companies which filed for Chapter 11 actually recovered. This number now has changed probably because in the last 2 years this is something that happened a lot. But even though it's a very low percentage of recovery, and one of the reasons that is easy to see is that the companies, when they file for Chapter 11, many of them should be filed for bankruptcy because they are already in a very late stage of problems. They already have tried to renegotiate that with the major creditors and couldn't find a solution, so they file as a remediation, as a last breath to try to find a solution. So, of course, this is not applicable to 100% of the cases, but I think it's a general perception of the market, and if anyone here has a different view, we're happy to hear. But I think what we hear in those discussions is that the filing is always late, and then it makes difficult for creditors, even though they may have priority over the other lenders and etc. A bank who is already exposed several billion reais to that company in distress, it's difficult to internally approve to give more money. Even though that might be a way to save the credit already at risk.
Well, I think as every lawyer and emergency room doctor knows, the patient waits too long, the client waits too long before they come and talk to you, notwithstanding your best efforts to educate them otherwise. But things must be going right in some way in Brazil. Megan just told us this huge bond for Azul was 10 times oversubscribed. So I guess foreign investors, and it is foreign investors that provide the liquidity, that provide the capital, have made some kind of assessment. What, Marcela, that kind of the worst is behind at this point, and we're kind of going forward?
Yeah, I think so much has happened over the last few years, and I think that the weaker credits, they have already filed. So we had like the whole sugar and ethanol sector that, most of the companies already restructured. You had gold that already went through somewhat of an attempt of a distressed exchange. You have oil that has been in this restructuring for a while now. Of the entire drilling sector, so it had a lot of OGX. It had a lot of restructurings over the last year, and I think the perception of the market is that now sort of the weaker players, we've already flagged them, and the stars have already playing out. I think right now, with the exception of Odebrecht construction, I think that's the only bond that is really trading at distressed levels now, and oil. But I think overall, the sense is that now we're entering a recovery period in Brazil. There's growth expected for next year. There is FX stabilization, inflation stabilization. So I think people are definitely becoming more constructive. I think creditors are being selective. I wouldn't say that it's any company that can come to the market. I think people are definitely doing more credit work, and I think they're also paying more attention to any corruption problems and sort of the character of the shareholder. I think is being analyzed more carefully now. But the companies have regained access to the market, and we are seeing spreads of Brazilian companies have tightened a lot over the last year. I mean, if you look at Petrobras, bonds have performed very well. So I think investors are more comfortable with the risk, and there is an expectation that the next government is going to be a government that's going to be positive for the country.
I guess we've sort of reached the trough, and we're starting to get some movement up and starting to see some capital formation. What is it that foreign investors look for to help in that? Okay.
Sure. So I would say within the emerging market investor space, there's still going to be those that are looking for yield. So, today the diesel bond priced, and obviously it was at very attractive rates when you compare it to where LATAM, another airline that has a large Brazilian exposure, priced just 12 months ago. They're over a point inside of that for a similar type of maturity. So I think, they're finding limited opportunities to invest in the U.S. transportation space, particularly on the airline side, at yields that are matching this. So I think, to the points earlier, I think there's obviously heightened caution and awareness around the characters involved in these companies, but I think that emerging market investors are looking at balance sheets, and I think if they find that the balance sheet is sound and there's still yield to be had, 6% for a 7-year bond is still a decent return for a lot of these guys. So I think it's really just identifying the opportunities where they can still play and earn a decent spread.
Questions?
Yeah.
How are you looking at some of the headwinds facing, whether it's AV?
Louder.
How are you looking at some of the headwinds on the commodity side facing some of these sectors, whether it's managing fuel costs on the aviation side, or for maritime, you have IMO sulfur cap coming up in 2020, and so when you're working with some of these companies facing some of these headwinds, like how are you approaching it, or how do you factor in what might be issues down the line?
Sure. So I can take a stab at that. I mean, I think on the maritime space, including offshore, there isn't necessarily this direct correlation between commodity prices, because at times they're sort of a natural hedge. So for the offshore guys, if you read Citi's research, I think we think there will be a true inflection point for around 2020, just given a more rationalization of supply, and I don't think there's been an issue on the demand front. So I think there, obviously, a rising oil price will benefit our clients. I think on the aviation side, there's the expectation that the balance sheets of all of the airlines, frankly, globally, have really benefited from this low fuel cost environment. I think the rating agencies are probably the first to say that if there is a jump and we do see a larger than expected increase in fuel, then there will be increased headwinds. And I would say that really from a banking perspective, on the maritime side, things really couldn't get much worse at this point. And so I don't think we necessarily view the commodity environment as a real stress. What we're really tending to focus on is day rates, and it's day rates whether that's in dry bulk, whether that's on the tanker side, whether it's LPG. I think there's distress across all of those subsectors. And so I would say on the aviation side, we're just seeing investors, lenders, everyone's quite bullish and are being quite aggressive. And so I don't know if they're necessarily pricing in a headwind that's anticipated on the fuel side.
Okay.
Is that going to change the way that companies access capital and the way that investors provide it?
have seen a change already. In the shipping space, they've had to find other ways to finance themselves. So you've seen a lot of maritime companies look to the sale-leaseback market. And so there's a lot of Chinese leasing companies that are coming onto the scene. There's a lot of leasing companies even in the US that are able to provide capital. And so they're tapping different sources. I think just generally, given the regulation that's required now of the banks, the ability to lend in massive ways to a select number of institutions. I mean, it's what happened with Seadrill. We have a lot of our colleagues at Citi who have large exposures. They have a 44 bank syndicate. And so, I think that you might see banks changing the way that they finance themselves in terms of these large syndicated deals and taking very outsized positions. I think the capital markets are going to become increasingly important for both, transportation clients generally, but also in the maritime space.
Is there room for private equity providers in this? Do you see more involvement or less involvement?
In connection with a restructuring?
Yeah, I think connection with.
It's basic satisfaction of capital needs in shipping.
I don't know that I'm sold yet, in all honesty. I clearly there's pockets where, companies have access to capital, but I want to be careful what I say, but I don't know that there's I know that there's a lot of people looking at stuff in shipping and spending a lot of time looking at Brazil from a new capital standpoint, but I don't know that. I think that a lot of people have been burned pretty badly, and I don't know that there's going to be a rush to provide capital outside certain pockets, at least for a while. That's my guess. Now, having said that, when kind of money flows into emerging market funds, it has to go somewhere. So,
I mean, we've certainly seen a lot.
We've certainly seen a lot of private equity money in shipping, and it's there. Some firms may be among the largest ship owners in the world, maybe private equity firms. So, I think I'm looking at my watch and I'm getting a sign from Rich that it's cocktail time. So
I was saying that at 4 o'clock.
So if there are no other questions, I'd say thank you very much, panel, and everyone, please adjourn to cocktails. Thank you.